So before we look at the actual pipeline and the folder structure for the pipeline, I want to describe the difference between asset files and shot files. So assets are essentially all of your files or your Maya files used for like the production stage or the first half of the project. This is where you're doing modeling, the rigging, the surfacing, the effects, layout. This is essentially creating all of your pieces for your film later on. Shots files is for when you're bringing together everything into a single location. So usually you do this with animation and rendering and sometimes lighting. An assets file, each file is essentially made to be referenced or imported into a later file, right? So the model files go into the rigs and surfacing. The layout and the rigs go into the animation and set dressing files. This is the command for it. Well, I'm not going to talk about specifically using like the commands for the pipeline right now, but this is kind of the difference between the two commands for making an asset and making a shot. So the shot files are the ones that are at the end. This is where you're bringing everything together. This is where you're creating your set dressing environment assets and bringing everything into one space. You're bringing in the character and you start doing your lighting and animation. Okay, I want to talk about the project space just to kind of give you guys an idea of what you're looking at when you open this. This might sound like a lot of information, but really once you get used to it, it's not that bad. So your project space might look something like this. This is on my home computer, so it's slightly different. But you essentially have two types of spaces within your project space. You have your working space, and that's the one where you're working on all of your files and you're kind of saving versions and making changes and everybody's doing their own thing. Then you have your release space, and that's where you're creating those release files. Those files that are kind of done. It's a version that you're not touching, you're not messing around with, and then someone else on your team can grab to use in their file without, safely. So release is where you should put your most up-to-date and stable versions of your files. So whenever you get to a point where your file is ready to be passed to another person, then you want to copy it over that version into the release space. All of your Maya files that are referenced in any other Maya files should only pull from the release space. So whenever you guys are doing any referencing, whether you're bringing in the character into the rig file, go ahead and create that release version in the release folder and then reference in that release file. So keeping this in mind and knowing where you guys are working is going to make your project much easier to manage, and it's going to be easier to communicate with your team and know where everything is. So your working space, in my opinion, this is how I set it up. Your working space should look almost just like your release space. Usually you have a lot more folders and a lot more files in your working space. You don't need as many things in your release space, right? Because you might be making a lot of different small assets that you combine into one asset in the working space. And then the release space, you only need that final asset you made. But you'll see here in my assets folder, I have the exact same kind of folder structure. So I have like an effects folder, a layout folder, a lights folder, look dev, model rigs, and I have the exact same folder structure in my release space. I think this is important because it makes it easy for people to understand where things are, because we have a lot of different disciplines or stages of the pipeline. So knowing that I'm working inside the effects folder and I push like a release version over here, then if someone in my team is going to be bringing that release version of the effects into a shot file, they know where to, because I know that structure of where I was working and because they know how we've been working in this area, they know where to find it in the release space. And then there might be multiple versions, and there should be multiple versions in your working space. So in the assets folder, so this is your project root directory, and you have your assets folder. So having multiple versions is totally normal, totally cool. So this is project assets, and this is my rigs folder. Inside that rigs folder, I have like Nefertiti or character rig. And so I have multiple versions as I've been working on it. In the release space, what's useful and in my opinion, pretty important is just making a single version, right? You want to make it as clear as day to the person who needs to grab that rig file, which version they're supposed to grab. If you have 80 different versions, which is totally normal to have ton of versions, but they all have slightly different names, or they have numbers, or you're saying newest one or fixed or use this one, right? At a certain point, it gets really confusing. So just having a single version in the release space is going to make it a lot easier for you. I like to still have backups. So creating like or backup folders. So even in the release folder, I might have a backup folder. So the latest version is always going to be on the outside, and inside the backup folders where my older versions are. You'll see here I'm taking these older versions, or every time I save a new version, I go ahead and put the older versions in the backup folder. This is a little bit more specific, but it's always a good idea to have your release version not have like the latest version number on it, because that actually breaks the reference. Because the reference file, like let's say I'm in the shots file and I want to bring in the Nefertiti rig with referencing, I'm looking for nefertitirig.ma. If I go ahead and save versions, it's going to increment these numbers on it. And so my latest version might be nefertitirig.007, right? That referencing, and I push that into the release space, that referencing file doesn't know to look at that. It's looking at the original one still. It doesn't know it should be looking for something called nefertitirig.007. So you'd have to update it, which isn't that big a deal, but it's probably better just to go ahead and get rid of that number in the release space. So in the release subfolders, you could work in that release folder. So we have our assets folder, shop folder, and we also have our release folder. If you really wanted to, what you could also do is you could just have a release folder within your main working space. So I'm in my working space, project, assets, rigs, character, and I have my Nefertiti rig, and I have my backup folder, and I can also have a release folder. So if you did it that way, then the person on your team, you would just say, okay, I'm done working on the rig. You can just go to the assets folder and then just grab the file from the release folder. So it's really up to you. A disadvantage to this is that it's a little bit harder in easily packing and zipping up and shipping things. So you can, if these are in two separate places, I theoretically could just grab this release folder and the shots folder if I wanted to like package it and bring it somewhere else. Like let's say I wanted to bring it to the school, like we've been working offline and we want to bring it to school, right? If everything's only in these two folders, I only need to bring these two folders. I don't need all the working files. I only need the release files. But if everything's combined into the assets folder, then you have to copy everything, and that gets a little tedious. Okay. Okay, the next slides I'm going to show you are going to be talking about how I recommend you link your files together. So how files flow from one to the next. So character file flows into the rig file, and the rig file flows into the animation file. These are just suggestions. Depending on your class, depending on your teacher, depending on if you're working with any mentors, they might have different suggestions or ideas. And not every project is the same. Some projects might have a ton of assets. Some might only have like 2 assets, like a character and like a table. And so in some cases, some of these things might be overkill, or you might just have to have a different setup. And so it takes a little thinking and planning ahead of time. And you guys will be adapting as you go. So don't worry about it too much. If you're just starting out and you're still figuring out what your project is, but keep this in mind that what I say here is not law. So this is how I prefer to handle the characters. So I create a character model file under assets models, and then I create a rig file under assets rigs, and I reference that character model into the character rig asset file, right? So we're creating that link where the character in here is being referenced in here, and every update I make in the character model gets pushed because of referencing into the rig file. Then once the rig is done, that character is being pushed into the shot file with referencing as well. So this, you'll see I'm highlighting orange when you should reference. So the rig file is referenced into the shot files, and that's where you're going to do your animation and bring all of your other environment assets and props together into one space. So it goes from the model file to the rig file to the shot file. And again, because of referencing, even if I have everything brought into the shot file, if I go into the character model and make a tweak and save over that reference file, it gets pushed all the way into the shot file, and that change now shows up in the shot file. Okay. Surfacing can be done in a number of ways. I don't think it's quite as crucial to this kind of chain of reference. Surfacing can either be like another stage, so you go from character model into surfacing model, surfacing file, and you reference the surfacing file into the rig file, or it can be something that's done in an outside file. So you take the character model and you bring it into the surfacing file, and then you just import that later into it. And I'm saying import, not referenced, just because with shaders, referencing with shaders with RenderMan is a little tricky, but I think this workflow is a lot more freeform to what works for your team. Some people also just do the surfacing in the modeling file. I don't recommend that. I think that's kind of messy, but whatever works for your team. For the environment's usually made up of a lot of assets if you're set dressing, right? So let's say I'm doing like the interior of a kitchen, right? There's a lot of different assets from like the sink, the refrigerator, the oven, the microwave, and these are all file objects I want to model separately, right? I don't want to model them all together. So what we do is we have all these props or environment assets as separate Maya files, and we reference these all into a single file called a set-dressed file or a set-dressed environment. So what happens is, again, when we're making that referencing chain, so if I need to make a change to the refrigerator, let's say I need to make it a little bit taller, I'm still keeping that referencing. So even as I'm doing the set dressing and laying out all of my assets inside my environment, if I need to go back and make a change, I don't have to redo all my work or re-import it in and replace it, right? I can place something, make a change, and then if I need to make a change, that reference is going to push it all the way into the set dress environment. And then that single set dress environment is then referenced into all my shot files. Okay, so my shot files again are how I'm breaking up my film into different parts based on camera or based on time. And so I'm bringing in that same environment into each of those shot files. Lighting can be done like this. So it can be started in a master file. So this is something I like to do personally, is I kind of take something like my set dress environment, I reference it into my master lighting file. So I see my environment, I see where at the scale of everything, where everything's placed, and I start doing basic lighting. This is what I call a master lighting file, is where you're doing your basic lighting, you're just kind of figuring out the lighting that'll work generally for all of your shots in that space. And then what you do is you can reference that master lighting file into your shot files. And so in the shot files, you're gonna have to tweak the lights so that they make sense for that shot, right? If I have a close up on a character's face, I'm gonna have to adjust some lights so that the lighting is hitting my character's face just right. But I don't need that change in all of my shots. I only need it in that specific shot. The animation pipeline looks something like this. This is my recommendation again. Is you can do your animation in the actual shot files, right? So we're bringing our character, our environment, and our lighting into the shot file. And we can do the animation straight in that shot file, but that's a lot of information that's coming into the shot file. Especially if you're doing on a laptop, that can be very, very slow for that file. And so it can be really hard to do animation in such a heavy file. So sometimes what I do is actually take that set dress file and I'll make a duplicate or a copy of it. I would delete or unload anything that's not needed. So for instance, if I was doing a character ordering a cup of coffee at Starbucks, right? I don't need all of the Starbucks environment or all the other characters or any of the other assets. All I really need is the counter, the character, and then maybe a coffee cup that they're interacting with, right? So simplified set dressing file is where the animator can go ahead and do all their animation work, and the file is dumbed down or simplified to a point that it's really easy and quick for them to make changes and see those changes. It's not going to crash their laptop. So the simplified set dress file is referenced into an animation shot file. So this is where you're actually doing the animation. And then that animation file is then referenced in the shot file. Something that I want to note here, and so come back to this if you do this, come back to this point in the video or remember this, ask me about this. But it's really important at this stage that you actually unload or delete everything from the simplified set dressed file and only have your character or the controls or the rig. Because if your set dressed file is going into your shop file, but if you also have this simplified set dressing file and it comes back into the shop file, then you have duplicates between between these two files coming to the same file. So at this stage, when you're like done doing your animation, you can go ahead and unload everything that you don't need. Like you don't need any of those environment assets once you're done with that when you're referencing into the shop file. So there's no single pipeline workflow solution. Make changes to the pipeline or how you guys structure it based on what works for your project. Number of characters, the size of your environment, if you guys are going to make changes to lighting, any new tools you want to use can all significantly change your approach. Go ahead and plan your project and test your workflow. And then stick to it. Don't make changes as much as you can. Like, don't give up on it. Don't, make decisions without informing your team. It seems really tedious when you first do it, and everybody hates figuring out their pipeline, but they also, at the end of the project, everybody who ignores it unanimously agrees at the end that they wish they spent more time kind of preparing and figuring it out because it makes the ending of your project a slog, and in some cases might even cause you to not finish your project because everything gets so complicated at the end. So you're going to want to have certain files for managing your project and making it easier for your team to communicate. Again, just like setting up your pipeline correctly, these things might seem tedious at first, but because working on a group project can be so complicated, it will save you a lot of time in the end. Some of those files that you'll want is a task management sheet. And so what this does is it keeps track of your assets and what stage they're at in the pipeline. So this is if something has been is currently being worked on, if it's done, if it's approved, if it's under review, and who's working on that asset. So you can see here we have these different assets in my project separated into these groups. And then we have the different stages of the pipeline. So like modeling, UV unwrapping, publishing. Later on, we'll have like shading and rigging. And so each of these assets and each stage of the pipeline has a person assigned to it and then a stage that asset's in. So you can see down here when we come to the kitchen door, right? This is just how this team decided to organize this, but you could have something like hasn't started yet, in progress, complete, under review, things like that. So this essentially makes it easy for the team at a glance to see where they're at and what assets are done, are still being worked on, things like that, and who's supposed to be working on it. Something else that you could have as well, this is something I've seen teams do, is a change log. So this is essentially a document, so let's say like a Word or text file, and it's in the same location as our asset, right? So let's say I'm in the rig file, or rigging folder, right? I could have like a little Word document or a little text document, and that file, so that text document, whether it's in this location or it's on your drive, will essentially list the changes of different versions, right? Because once you have like 8, 9, 30 changes or 30 versions, it gets a little hard to keep track of what's changed between files. And especially if you need to roll back. So let's say you made a change really onto your rig and you need to go back to that old version, even though it's like 10 versions old or 10 versions ago. It's a lot easier, or it can be really difficult to go back and load each one in and be like, okay, what did I do in this one? Oh, this is where I added this control. Okay, I need to go back another version. So if you had a version log or a change log, that would be easy to keep track of which file you did what. Okay. So that's that change log. The asset reservation sheet could be something kind of like this, where you list out all of your assets, and you'd also have things like the modeling file, the rigging file, the lighting file. And so this is kind of like an occupied sign for your files. It just lets people know that you're currently working in it. So if multiple people are working on a single file, so let's say Billy on your team is doing the texturing in the lookdev file, and then Marla is also messing around with the shaders in the lookdev file, in the same lookdev file for the character. And you guys, then they're like, taking turns coming in and making changes, right? Not everybody's going to be working on a single file and that file's only theirs. It's very common for people to dive into the same file other people have been working in. This is to prevent you guys from doing it at the same time. Because the problem is if I'm in the character rig file, let's say, and I'm making changes, and then Drew, who's also my team, is also in that file at the same time, but we don't know it. If I make a save, I might save my version on the project, and I'm like, cool, okay, all the changes I made are now saved for it. But because Drew has an older version of the file open, when he saves it, it's actually going to replace my file or save over my file, the one that I just saved. And so actually I thought I made all those changes, but he just accidentally saved over everything because we didn't know we were working on the same file at the same time. So if you're running into this issue or you feel like your team is using the same files as each other, then I would recommend that you use something like this.